How do you tell the story of St. Louis? Beer, brick, and baseball are all part of the story plot, but you can't leave out brains, heart, and soul. A new campaign called STL Made shows through individual stories that smart people get an education here, then stay and excel in biotech and health. That a Midwestern spirit of generosity and inclusiveness is deep in our bones, and that music and art feed the spirit and bring us together. This multimedia campaign is a first step by a new civic organization with a goal of attracting businesses to the St. Louis region. Calling itself Alliance STL, the private sector group will take over where other organizations have failed. The new group will reframe the story of the metro region and sell the strengths of St. Louis to businesses looking to relocate or expand. At the helm of Alliance St. Louis is Steve Johnson. Formerly the CEO of the Missouri Partnership, he and his team of 7 will present a unified message about St. Louis and the many advantages it offers to businesses. I sat down for an in-depth interview with Steve Johnson for the inside story on him as a civic leader and the organization he heads. And now, a conversation with Steve Johnson. Steve, let's start with the really tough questions first. Tell me, who is Steve Johnson personally?
That's always the toughest question because I'm a fairly private person. So I am someone who has a large family, has children, grandchildren, and loves to do everything I can with them. Unfortunately, they're spread coast to coast, and sometimes it's hard to spend as much time with family as I would like.
Now, everybody in St. Louis is going to wonder, are you from St. Louis?
No, I'm not. Well, I have been since 2004. I grew up in mid-Missouri in Jefferson City. Left there in the mid-1980s to pursue. I've been working in economic development for 35 years. I think that's right, since about 1983.
So when people ask you, where did you go to high school, you tell them what?
I say Jefferson City High School.
There you go.
Yeah, had one of the most successful football programs in the nation. So,
professionally, what do you bring to the table? What's your background?
More than just a little experience. 35 years. I've been working specifically on recruiting businesses to metropolitan areas. And you learn a lot. You learn a lot of what doesn't work, which sometimes are the most valuable lessons. But I've become convinced, and people on my team hear me say this all the time, just to jump right into what we do, I am convinced to my very core that if our team and anybody who's involved in economic development, in business recruitment, if we do our jobs exceedingly well, we are going to recruit businesses to whatever metro you're working for, but we will recruit businesses to St. Louis that would not have come here otherwise. And it's a lot about people doing business with other people.
As you said, you've been in this business a long time. You had a very good job over at the Missouri Partnership. What compelled you to take this position with a new organization?
Take a look at our board of directors. It's a very strong board made up of CEO leadership from around St. Louis. When you have those people coming together and say, this is what we want to do, and then when you visit with them individually and you see how engaged they are and how much they want this to be successful, that's what gets you excited. And that's what made me leave a job that I thought I would be at for the rest of my career, an organization I loved, the Missouri Partnership. But that's what made me say, this is something I want to do, and see if we can begin the process of building an organization that over the next several decades becomes one of just the best in the United States.
You've got a lot of power behind you. If this group can't make it happen, it can't be done?
I'm not sure if I'd go quite that far, but you're not far off, pretty close.
Why was the Alliance formed? That you took a lot of very high-level people to come together to make this happen.
Yeah. I think St. Louis had entered a phase over the last couple of years where there was a little bit of uncertainty in the marketplace as to who was doing what. And the business leaders, I think, came together and said, you know, we understand that so this term economic development can be used to apply to about anything you want it to. They get that, they understand that. But they said we need a more concentrated, focused effort in St. Louis on telling St. Louis's story and actively, professionally recruiting business to the region. We want the metropolitan area to coalesce around this one organization. I mean, it's nothing we can do without partners throughout the entire metropolitan area. And it's not that none of this was going on, but saying let's double down on how we tell the St. Louis story and how we go about it from a professional standpoint of recruiting business, because it's a very competitive business.
So there was a little sense of frustration that things just weren't moving fast enough or strongly enough?
I think so, yeah.
Now there is a perception of many times in economic development of the city versus the county. And that's in recent months really come to the fore. How do you get around something like that?
I think you tell stories. I think you introduce your clients to people who have vested interest in both. You let them meet the business community. And that perception, that's an internal perception. That's not an external perception. People outside the market, it's almost too strong to say they don't know and they don't care. It's not quite that clear cut. But they don't know that the city of St. Louis is not part of St. Louis County. They look at St. Louis as a major metropolitan area. They look at one workforce, one economy, one lifestyle that just happens to be spread out over 15 counties and 2 states. That's the St. Louis marketplace, and that's the product that we take to the market every time. So about 5 years ago, I think the St. Louis Development Corporation and what was then called the St. Louis County Economic Council merged a large part of their operations, just to say let's act like we're a metropolitan area. And there was a case probably less than a year in where a company in Chesterfield had some very specific needs that could not be addressed at the building that they were in Chesterfield. And it was a company that it was a very established old company, and they wanted to completely change the impression of themselves in the marketplace. Cortex was kind of really ramping up.
New and vibrant.
We want to be there to just kind of rebrand ourselves as an organization. In the past, I won't go so far to say that there wasn't competition between the city and the county, but in the past that would have been looked at as the city stealing something from the county. But what people forget is these companies always had options. Their parent company had vacant facilities in Chicago and Memphis, and we're saying, go to one of those. And so if they hadn't been able to find this innovative space in the city of St. Louis, they would likely have left the marketplace altogether. But the way it worked, because the two groups were together, it was a seamless process, and they focused on what the business needs. And that's what gets lost sometimes. Is, at the community level, you want to focus on, well, what do we need from this business, when you really should be focusing on what's the business solution, and that's how you win.
You're really functioning on 2 different levels here. The external, broad scope, all St. Louis, one big metropolitan area, but internally you're going to have some people saying, look, my city is just as good as this city for this new company that's coming in. Why don't you bring it to my community, Steve? Don't let it go to them, and you'll have those little bitty territorial squabbles. How do you deal with those?
That's fine. Every city, every municipality, every neighborhood may compete just to the fullest on every project, but you've got to keep that away from the client. So if we're representing a client, a prospect that's considering St. Louis, and always, if they're looking at St. Louis, they're looking at several other major metropolitan areas as well, we will always really work very hard to understand what the business is looking for. So we'll get them to lay out their parameters. So we'll take their parameters, we'll stretch them as far as we think we can, and still keep our credibility. And then it's our responsibility to make them aware of everything within the boundaries that fits their parameters. And then
so you'll lay out the number of communities and say it's your choice.
Absolutely. And it's still one workforce, but they drive the process. Because the first, and I used to tell this a lot when I was with Missouri Partnership, and I'd go around the state and you'd have county officials say, you know, just bring, we've never lost a project, just bring us a project. But I would explain to them that the first time that you tell one of your clients where you say, you know, you told me this was important, but I really think you need to look over here instead. The first time you do that and you say, your needs aren't important to me, you're done. You've lost credibility. And all the this recruitment process is really a big process of elimination. Companies are just looking for a reason to cross you off the list, and they're gone.
So you don't see a problem potentially with cities trying to end run you and say, well, I see an opportunity here, I'm just going to bypass the Alliance, I'm going to see if I can win it for my community rather than be on a par with so many others?
If they have a project that they have established the relationship, it's their project, then we become their support staff and we come to work for them. But if we are leading a project, they will never go around us directly to the client. A lot of times we're not at liberty to even tell them who the client is, but if we are able to share that information, the protocols that we put together and that we're refreshing right now really revolve around who owns that relationship. And I always say it's a cardinal sin. If we bring you into a project or you bring us into a project and someone goes around whoever owns that relationship, it may be a long time before we ever do business.
So there will be consequences.
There has to be. And it's not so much about control or credit, it's about being effective and about getting the deal done. Because the clients can, if they can sense dysfunction in a community.
Well, when I moved to St. Louis 47 some odd years ago, I was told early on that St. Louisans have a sixth sense, a sense of inferiority about St. Louis. Do you see that as an issue today?
I might not go quite that far, but we do have a certain modestness, as you know, Midwestern.
Too modest?
Midwestern modestness. And so even if you look at the research that went into the launch of STL Made and that whole campaign about their narrative, I think the research bears it out. That externally, we have kind of a blank slate, a clean slate to work with. The impressions and images are pretty much neutral. Locally, we've got to start telling a better story among ourselves and getting people to the point where they have a little bit of attitude or a little bit of swagger.
A swagger? That'd be nice.
About St. Louis. There's so much that we should be celebrating.
What are going to be your biggest challenges in the external marketing of our city?
Biggest challenges are some that are fairly intractable and hard to change in the short term. So as I was meeting with our new board for the first time, I'm big about, the first thing we need to get right is the purpose statement. You know, here's why we were created as an organization. And the way I phrase it, to stimulate sustained regional growth by winning competitive business investment, but stimulating sustained regional growth. We grow at such a slow rate that communicates to others that they might have trouble recruiting the workforce that they need, that maybe it's not as vibrant, you don't have the influx of new people. So we've got to do everything we can as a region.
We appear to the nation as being stagnant?
A little bit. You know, when I moved here in 2004, we were I think the 18th largest metropolitan area. We're now the 21st. And so people say, oh, we've lost, you know, we haven't lost population. We've just, three other markets have gone past us.
We haven't kept up with the rest of the country. We're not even average in our growth.
No, we're not. And that would be a big bump up if we could just, the first thing we have to do is catch up with the U.S. average, and then we can surpass it over time. But these are not things that are changed quickly. So
how are you going to attack this problem?
I'm going to take my little piece of the equation, and I think economic development from a business recruitment standpoint can begin to create kind of a flywheel effect. I mean, the numbers associated with projects that we can successfully recruit are not big enough to, you know, all of a sudden catch up a gap of, you know, tens and twenties of thousands of people. So we will focus on what we can, and that's business recruitment. It's a small piece of economic development, but it's a very visible piece, and it's a psychological piece that people begin saying, oh, well, this company chose to go to St. Louis or come to St. Louis. How about that? And it starts just reinforcing that, and it all starts to build on each other.
Kind of create an attitude of a winner.
Yeah, easily said, but absolutely.
Hard to do. What can the viewers out there do to help you? I'm sure we'd all like to see St. Louis get its swagger back and assume its rightful place in a national leadership position.
Do the hard work of understanding St. Louis, and don't always buy into just the common gossip and rumors about how negative things are, but really start to dig in and do your homework and look at what we have as a marketplace and be an ambassador, be willing to share that with people. The one thing I would recommend is that everybody spend time on the new website, just STL.com. This is where the whole STL Made initiative, it's where they live. I mean, it's where that lives, and it's just stories. It's just stories about St. Louis. And I think it's being directed to St. Louisans this first year, but it's a very significant attempt to just change the narrative about St. Louis. So first, change it internally, how we talk about St. Louis ourselves, how we think about St. Louis ourselves, and then nationwide. We will be using that, everything related with STL Made, we will be using that extensively in our marketing of St. Louis.
You sound optimistic but realistic at the same time.
Yeah.
It's not going to be an overnight change.
No, nothing happens overnight, and this is not the kind of business that you get in and get out of. You get in for the long haul, and you need to be committed for the long haul.
How will you measure success yourself? What will it look like?
So traditional measures, and it sounds like you were listening at my board meeting.
Oh, there's a little microphone over there. No.
The way we traditionally measure success, it's a pretty transactional business. So we will look at the number of transactions that we've closed throughout the year, and then associated with that will be the number of new jobs they will create, the new annual payroll that infuses into the regional economy, which I think is one of the best and most conservative, but one of the best measures, because it takes just new discretionary income that is now into the regional economy. And then the capital expenditures. So it's jobs, payroll, and CapEx is how we measure success. Then where I think we, kind of the larger we, the business community, is probably going, is an overarching regional business plan or strategic plan for the region. And so we would have one part of that. And I think that's where you will see some targets and long-term goals for some of the more macroeconomic measures. So we will have our piece, the part that we can influence. But it's traditionally those transactions, jobs, payroll, and investment.
And a big hurdle is getting St. Louis to speak with one voice to the nation, and to the business community around the world.
But that's not as big a hurdle as people think. I think we can do that. I think we can do that.
Where does the Alliance come down on the Better Together movement?
We will not, we're not the kind of organization that takes a position on that. You look at the leadership around our board, many of them have taken a position on that. We will, I will go so far to say that, and this is more me personally, embraces the vision of the synergies and the efficiencies that seem to be the long-term goal of this initiative, and how we get there. I'm not gonna weigh in on those details. But so you have this conversation around town all the time, and the one thing everybody agrees on is something needs to change. We need to do something different. What we're doing has not been successful. Yeah, I mean, that's too strong that's probably too strong of a statement, but we can do better. And so that's kind of where I am.
That's the kind of thing that gets you going, isn't it? It kind of revs up your engine.
It does. And it's, because you started off the interview with who am I? And good, better, and different, I'm a very competitive person. And that's just always been a kind of part of who I am. And this is a very competitive process. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen too many times where you can win a project that actually was destined for somewhere else. I mean, obviously there are some projects that we will win that were probably a slam dunk. I'll never admit that. Most of the time, say, no.
Good hard work.
Hard work.
Yeah.
But there are projects, and some significant projects that I've been associated with that when the dust settles and you go back into a debrief and you're kind of friends with the people you worked with, they will tell you that they were headed somewhere else. But so it's just not the professional economic development team, but it's the way you engage the business community, it's the way you engage the public sector leadership, all have to come together sometimes on these big projects to really make a difference, and it can work.
You know, we've talked about some of the detriments to bringing business to St. Louis, some of the things that we don't have. What are our assets? What are the good things that you're going to go out there and pound away on?
I'll use an example of a presentation I gave a week ago in Mexico City. Consider this, that we're meeting new friends here with these business leaders from Mexico. And so I'd say, here's a few things, not everything, here's a few things that I want you to know. And I started off with St. Louis is a major, and we don't think of ourselves this way, but St. Louis is a major higher education center in the middle of the country. If you look at, and I don't have all the numbers committed to heart, but I think 30 colleges and universities and then that doesn't even count the community college, but just 30 colleges and universities with about 140,000 students enrolled. But if you broaden your circle to 2 hours, I mean, it's over 400,000 students enrolled. And so in St. Louis is the biggest metro just in the center of all that. So we need to think of ourselves that way, and we need to market ourselves that way, because that's our potential talent base. And then you start talking about some of the legacy industries that have made St. Louis what they are, and that would include obviously logistics and distribution. That's why we're here, for goodness sakes. That's why we were founded, and it still continues to be a very good strength for St. Louis. But you talk about that, you talk about aerospace and automotive. I mean, the Boeing is just going gangbusters right now on with the TX trainer and some of their new new contracts. You talk about the financial services, and just all the ripple effect from each of these. You talk about we're a nationally recognized center for health, and in biotech and ag tech are some of the newer places we're going. And I'm as excited as I can be, even though I can't explain to you yet what it is. This whole industry sector about geospatial. I think St. Louis has the opportunity to redefine itself over the next 10 to 15 years as a major center for geospatial and everything that goes with it. So, and you talked earlier about the city-county perceived competition. One of the most encouraging displays of cooperation that I've seen in my 15 years in St. Louis was when, during the middle of that, toward the end of that competition, there were sites in the city and the county, and obviously still on the Illinois side as well. But when the county basically stood down and said, we're going to support the site in the city. And I was not involved in the project, so I was kind of on just outside looking in. But to me, that was one of the greatest examples of how this can work as a region, and I think it probably made a significant difference for the project.
For the greater good. Step back a second. Let me give you an opportunity to look at the camera over my shoulder and talk directly to the hundreds of thousands of people who will watch this, and give them your elevator pitch. What can they do to help you, either directly or indirectly?
So when you're on the airplane, and don't apologize for being from St. Louis. Talk to people about all the things that are going on in the region. We've got this midtown corridor. Look at Arch to Park, and there's just basically the spine along Market Street. That I think there's over $8 billion worth of investment going on. Talk about just all the things that you love about St. Louis that probably we all take for granted. Talk about the affordability of St. Louis. I think we're the 9th most affordable major market in the country. And just start promoting St. Louis for everything that you can, because it makes a difference.
Be St. Louis proud.
Be St. Louis proud. STL Made.
Is there anything you'd like to talk about that I haven't covered?
I think this is a point in time in St. Louis. I've called it an inflection point. I think we're experiencing the convergence of several very positive things, and much of it is development oriented, but I think it begins to change the fabric of St. Louis. I think it begins to change just the outside perception, and so that is another reason I accepted this job, because I think the time I think the time is ripe for us to be telling this story. It's not an overnight. It's not a situation of, okay, let's put some ads out there and then everybody. It's not that, but it's the time to begin doing the hard work, laying the groundwork, and building on some pretty strong foundations that have been laid, and the business leadership is front and center, and they're doing everything they can.
So you think in the future people will look back and say, that was the turning point?
Maybe.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. But I think just what is going on from a development standpoint, with the geospatial and some things like that, with the campus being built in north of Midtown, right in there, I think those are turning points. And I know this sounds pretty city-centric, and we're a big, sprawling metropolitan region. You've got to be a suburb of somewhere, and that's kind of where it focuses, and that's what people think of when they think of St. Louis.
Start with the heart and build outward. Steve, thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks.
I'm very optimistic, and count on us to do whatever we can do to help you out.
Sure will. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.